Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into one of those really big questions, maybe the biggest. What happens after we die? Does it all just switch off? Or, is there
Right.
something else?
It's a question that's woven through pretty much all of human history, hasn't it? Shaping beliefs, philosophies, everything.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, we've been looking at source material that really tries to map out this whole concept, life after death. It's, well, a pretty detailed overview of all the different ideas about consciousness after the body stops.
Right. And our aim here, really, is to walk through that landscape with you. We're not pushing any one viewpoint. The idea is to unpack how this huge question gets tackled from different angles, religious, spiritual, philosophical, even scientific perspectives, and just pull out the interesting insights from the material we looked at.
Think of it like getting the lay of the land. Okay, so where do we start?
Well, let's begin with the core idea itself, as the source presents it. Fundamentally, life after death. It's described as a religious, spiritual, metaphysical concept. The basic idea is that consciousness, the self that feels tied to our body, doesn't just evaporate when the body dies.
Right, it keeps going somehow. Maybe in a different place, an afterlife, or maybe through something like reincarnation, come back in a new body.
Exactly. And a really common thread the material points out in many belief systems is this idea that how you continue is often connected to how you lived. There's often some kind of reward or punishment involved.
Okay, so that's the basic premise. The source then kind of categorizes the different types of belief. What's the main way it splits them up?
The first big split is the survival, personal or non-personal. Most traditions seem to focus on personal survival, the idea that you remain you in some recognizable way.
And even within that personal survival idea, there are different takes, like actual physical survival. The material mentions bodily resurrection, maybe linked to a judgment day.
Precisely. Or, more commonly perhaps, the idea of non-material survival. Your soul or spirit goes on, to an afterlife without the original body.
And then there's that sort of hybrid idea, reincarnation, where the non-material part, the soul, carries on but gets a new physical body later.
Correct. And the source contrasts all that with non-personal survival. That's less common. But it's the idea that the individual self kind of dissolves and consciousness merges into something larger, like a collective consciousness, losing those individual boundaries.
It's amazing how many variations there are on just the basic how. Okay, let's maybe dig into some specific religious Vedas presented in the source. Starting with Judaism. The material says the concept isn't quite as central or systematically laid out as in, say, Christianity or Islam.
That's the picture it taints.
Yeah.
There's the concept of Olam Haba, the world to come, but the material suggests it's not always the main focus when discussing what happens right after death in Jewish thought.
And what's the view of many rabbis, according to the source, about what happens right when someone dies?
Well, the source describes a common view involving an inseparable link between body and soul. So when the body dies, the spirit, which is seen as this life force from God, goes back to God. The conscious individual, as we understand them, basically ceases to be until a future resurrection. That's when spirit and body reunite and the person becomes whole and conscious again.
Ah, okay. So consciousness is tied to that future event. Now, shifting to Christianity, the source emphasizes this is a really core doctrine,
Oh, absolutely central. A key event is the Day of Judgment, which involves resurrection.
followed by, you mentioned, reward or punishment based on life.
Exactly. The material outlines the traditional Christian outcomes. Eternal life in God's kingdom for those deemed righteous, sometimes described as seeing God. And for others, punishment often using imagery like a lake of fire called the second death.
The source also brings up the Catholic concept of purgatory, like a purification stage.
Right? A sort of temporary state before reaching the final destination. And, speaking of intermediate states, the material highlights there are actually different views within Christianity about what happens right after death, before that final resurrection.
This is where it gets quite complex, doesn't it? Some traditions, the source points out, believe people are just unconscious after death until the general resurrection.
Hmm.
And this view is sometimes linked to seeing body and soul as, well, more interdependent. Maybe the idea of a totally separate soul was influenced by Greek philosophy, like Plato. The source mentions certain evangelical churches and Jehovah's Witnesses sometimes holding this view.
Yeah, whereas other Christian perspectives described in the material talk about an intermediate state, like souls are conscious and waiting, maybe in comfort or torment, before they're finally reunited with their resurrected bodies. The parable of the rich man and Lazarus often comes up here.
Although the source does note that some interpret that parable more allegorically, as a story about earthly actions having consequences, not necessarily a literal description of the immediate afterlife. It just shows the range of interpretation.
Absolutely. It's not monolithic at all.
Okay, let's switch tracks a bit. Moving from religious doctrines to perspectives based more on direct human experiences or observations?
Right. This gets into things like near-death experiences or NDEs, out-of-body experiences, mediumship. The source mentions researchers who've studied these, like Pim van Lommel.
And the big debate here, as the source frames it, is are these real glimpses of something beyond the physical brain? Or are they, incredibly complex things the brain itself produces under unusual circumstances, like extreme stress?
That really is the crux of it. And near-death experiences are probably the most studied and debated in this area.
So the source defines NDEs as these really intense experiences people report when they were clinically close to death, feeling like they, well, almost crossed over or briefly entered some other state.
And within fields like parapsychology, they're often pointed to as maybe the closest thing we have to empirical support for an afterlife. It's subjective evidence, of course, because objective proof is elusive.
One thing the material really highlights is how similar many NDE accounts are. It lists these common themes: feelings of incredible peace, no pain,
Feeling like you've left your physical body.
traveling through a dark space, often like a tunnel, toward this brilliant light.
Meeting beings of light. Sometimes people recognize deceased relatives or religious figures.
And that really profound life review, where people feel like they're seeing their whole life flash before them and evaluating it.
Yeah, and the material points out that people who have these experiences often say they didn't want to come back, and it fundamentally changes them. Often they lose their fear of death entirely.
But, and this is important, the source material also presents the skeptical perspective that these could be explained physiologically or psychologically. Maybe it's like a complex dream state or hallucinations the brain produces when it's shutting down or under extreme stress. And the details are filled in by the person's own culture and beliefs.
Which loops us right back to that core question about consciousness in the brain.
Exactly.
Right.
Which leads nicely into the scientific viewpoint, particularly from neuroscience, as outlined in the source. What's the main takeaway there?
Well, the dominant view in neuroscience, as presented, is that consciousness is fundamentally tied to the physical brain working properly. The material explains that if the brain is damaged, consciousness is impaired. If the brain dies, consciousness is irreversibly gone. It's seen as a result of complex brain processes.
So consciousness is what the brain does, essentially. What kind of evidence does the source say supports this?
It mentions several lines of evidence. Things like functional brain imaging, scans showing specific brain areas lighting up during specific thoughts or feelings. Also, the clear link between how the brain develops from infancy onwards and how cognitive abilities develop.
And I suppose directly messing with the brain changes consciousness.
Right. Experimental manipulation, that's a big one. Using drugs that affect brain chemistry, electrical or magnetic stimulation, even newer techniques like optogenetics and lab settings, they all show that altering brain activity alters conscious experience.
Plus, cases of brain injury. The source mentions Phineas Gage, that classic example where damage to a part of his brain completely changed his personality. It really shows how dependent consciousness seems to be on the physical brain.
Taking all that together, the conclusion from this perspective, as the source describes it, is pretty stark. Consciousness can't survive brain death. It's just gone, sometimes called eternal oblivion or simply non-existence.
But the source adds a really crucial point of clarification there.
It does.
This conclusion is largely based on the lack of scientifically verifiable evidence for consciousness surviving.
Precisely. It notes that scientific thinking often operates on the principle that you need positive evidence to accept a claim. So an absence of proof is treated as proof of absence, unless or until convincing contrary evidence emerges. So while the mainstream scientific view is what it is, it doesn't necessarily mean the possibility is absolutely philosophically ruled out forever. And that's why the debate continues.
That's a key distinction. And it leaves the door open, conceptually at least, for counterarguments and different philosophical takes, which the source also touches on.
Definitely. Challenges come from religious traditions, obviously, with the idea of an immaterial soul. But the material also mentions some philosophical ideas, even from non-religious thinkers, suggesting consciousness itself might be non-physical, or made of something fundamental we don't grasp yet.
And what's a core driver behind some of these alternative ideas?
A big one is what philosophers call the explanatory gap. It's basically the puzzle of how physical stuff, neurons firing, chemicals reacting, can possibly give rise to subjective feeling, the redness of red, the feeling of sadness, that first-person experience. If we can't bridge that gap, maybe the brain isn't producing consciousness.
And that's where you get these other theories mentioned in the material, like
Hmm.
neutral monism or panpsychism, the idea that maybe consciousness is fundamental, like mass or charge, or even some speculative physics ideas about quantum consciousness.
Right. The common thread in some of these is that consciousness isn't generated by the brain, but maybe it's something the brain tunes into or receives.
Ah, like that analogy, the source uses the brain as a radio receiver. The radio breaks down, the music stops playing, but the broadcast signal is still out there. Consciousness, the signal, might persist even if the receiver, the brain, dies.
It's a powerful analogy. But, as the material rightly points out, the massive hurdle is testing these ideas. If consciousness is immaterial or fundamental in this way, how do you measure it? How do you prove or disprove it scientifically? That makes these views really interesting, but also, highly controversial.
Okay, wow. We've covered a lot of ground. Let's maybe just try to quickly pull the threads together from the source material we explored.
Okay, so we started with that basic concept. Consciousness may be continuing after death, often tied to your life's actions. We saw the split between personal and non-personal survival, things like resurrection, souls going somewhere else, reincarnation.
hmm We looked at specific religious frameworks in Judaism and Christianity, noticing their different nuances about what happens and when.
Then we shifted to perspectives rooted in experience, especially those compelling patterned accounts from near-death experiences, but also acknowledging the big question, is it brain-based or something more?
Right. And then we got into the neuroscience perspective, which presents a strong case based on a lot of evidence, linking consciousness tightly to the brain, leading to the view that it ends when the brain ends. But, crucially, acknowledging this is based on current evidence, not absolute philosophical certainty.
And finally, we touched on those counter-arguments and alternative ideas, wrestling with the hard problem of consciousness, proposing maybe the brain isn't the generator, but more like a receiver.
What really comes through from looking at all this material together is just there's no single easy answer that everyone agrees on about what happens when we die. It's this incredibly rich, complex, sometimes contradictory picture. You've got deep faith, powerful personal experiences, hard science, and really profound philosophical questions all tangled together.
It really underscores that maybe the point isn't finding one simple solution, but appreciating the depth of the mystery itself.
So, thinking about everything we've just discussed from the source material, the ancient beliefs, the scientific findings, those striking NDE stories, what does that leave you thinking about? When you weigh the strong scientific evidence connecting consciousness to the physical brain against these persistent, powerful, subjective experiences that seem to suggest otherwise, what does that tension suggest to you about what consciousness actually is? Is it just biology? Or is it something else that the brain somehow interacts with?
That question just hangs there, doesn't it?
It really does. A fascinating place to leave it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.